This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Welcome to this episode of the podcast, and it's the second week on the bounce I've had a cough and cold, so apologies once again for sounding terrible. So this week's guest is my second ever returning guest, Fiona Edmond of Green Island Gardens, a garden and nursery in Essex. Fiona holds National Plant Collection status for her range of camellias, which includes winter-spring flowering varieties, but also the sometimes overlooked autumn flowering varieties. Unjustly so, as they offer colour in the garden when little else is happening. Fiona begins by explaining the differences between the two.
The spring flowering camellias generally tend to have large, blousy flowers, quite wide, shiny, glossy leaves, and they tend to get taken out by the frost quite badly. They are beautiful, they herald spring, but they're very, very particular about where they're grown. As I say, they get taken out by the frost, so they need shelter or part shade is best for them. They definitely need moisture in the summer to give them the right conditions for producing flowers for the following year. But most importantly, they require an acidic soil. And if they don't have that, they suffer from what's called chlorosis, where the leaves turn yellow and they grow very poorly and just generally look very sick. So the autumn flowering camellias, the flowers tend to be smaller, same sort of colour range. They're mostly... they're singles and part doubles, but they look much more in proportion, I would say, with the shrub than the large, big, blousy ones. They start flowering, usually the earliest ones in October, and some of them go on for up to 6 months, I've had in the past, producing a succession of flowers, unlike the spring flowers that just have one blooming session and that's it. They've then finished. The autumn flowering ones also have a beautiful scent, which is a real bonus. You don't get that with the spring flowers. And they're much more tolerant of, I would say, non-perfect conditions. So they will do better in full sun, and they will tolerate slightly less acidic soils and slightly more clayey soils, which the spring flowering ones won't. They have smaller, narrower leaves in general, and often the new leaves are beautifully coloured, sort of a burgundy red colour when they come in. And they're much more versatile as well. They can be grown as shrubs, wall shrubs, or even as hedging, which is an extra bonus. So they're very versatile plants, but very they're not widely grown. Not many people know about them.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack in there. So I'm going to start going back very quickly to the spring flowering. Just you spoke obviously about the flowers spoiling if they get frosted. Are there any varieties that don't do that?
What, the spring flowering
Yes,
ones?
yeah.
Well, I would say no, there are none that don't, but the whites and the yellow flowered ones seem to be the worst, obviously because they just turn to brown and mush. And the other thing is that a lot of the varieties hold on to the flowers once they're frosted, so they really look messy instead of dropping them. There are some that do drop them, but a lot of them hold on to them. Whereas the autumn flowers, if we do get a really, really, really hard frost, which is unusual before Christmas, then you might lose some of the blooms, but very quickly those are dropped and you get another succession coming. So you don't lose the whole flowering season of them to frost in the same way.
What are the main varieties of the autumn flowering ones, and maybe the spring ones if there's not too many? And do you grow any of the spring ones in your garden?
Well, I'll start with the spring ones. We grow masses and masses. In fact, there's a much wider range of those than there is of autumn flowering ones available. But most of those will be japonicas or ex-Williamsii crosses. And a lot of those, the Williamsii crosses, have been bred specifically to not hold on to the flowers once they've passed or got frosted. But that doesn't mean to say that they all do drop them as they're supposed to. So those are the main ones. But for the autumn flowers, most of them are sasanquas, There have been a lot of hybrids bred in Australia and America, but most of the ones available that you will find on the market will be Camellias, Sasanqua, and then a hybrid name. And as I say, there aren't as many of those available. We do have a lot here because we've got a collection, but a lot of those have been imported and are just not widely grown. They're not available on the market, which is a shame because people just don't know about them.
Yeah, I don't think they do at all. I think everybody goes for the blousy flowers in the garden centres as they see them when they're out.
Well, that's right. Well, the garden centres don't tend to stock the autumn flowering ones because by the time they're all flowering in October, November, the peak time for flowering of autumn camellias is November. But how many people go to a garden centre in November to buy a plant for their garden? It's nearly all. By November, they're going to buy something for Christmas. They're buying presents or they go inside. It's not warm weather and people aren't thinking about their gardens. So the garden centres can't stock their nursery areas with lots of flowering camellias, autumn flowering camellias, and expect to sell them in the same way they do in the spring, where they'll often import the plants that have been bred and grown specifically to target the market for people, the majority of people who start thinking about their gardens in the spring. Often Easter weekend is a big time, or when we get the first weekend of really, really good weather, everyone suddenly starts thinking about their garden for the spring, and you'll see the garden centres are actually absolutely overrun with people with trolleys full of plants. And I always laugh because when I go to the garden centre or the nursery to buy something, I'll stand in the queue and I'll have a little bet with myself that everybody in front, every plant they're buying will have flowers on it. And this is the problem with the autumn flowering camellias. Their time of flowering is not when the general public are in the nursery. People are sucked in by things that have pretty flowers on at that time. And not enough of the garden centres do enough to educate people about getting their gardens to look good for 12 months of the year, and encouraging them to buy something that doesn't necessarily have flowers on it the day they take it home.
And of course, as you say, this is a really good time to get those kind of colours and those flowers into your garden because
that's right.
They're so
Most
rare.
People's gardens, they're putting to bed for the winter and they don't think about, what's coming out now and how it can look good for the next 2 or 3 months.
I do it. I go to the garden centre. I pack my trolley full of flour. I'm as guilty as anybody else. But I think it sounds as if the right way to do it is to go and visit places where these plants are specifically seen kind of in their element, and then to select the ones that you want there and then. So there might be a little bit of self-control involved because you might not be able to take them home straight away. But if people did want to go and see the autumn flowering varieties, obviously your garden's a good place to see them. Can you recommend anywhere else kind of nationally where people might find them?
Yeah, the other national collection of autumn flowering camellias, in fact, I'm not sure if they're autumn and winter, I think they're autumn, but is Caroline Bell in Devon. She has a much more mature selection than I do, but it's a very long way to Devon, to Essex, so it's quite good that we're spread apart. I think there's one more being built up, but I'm not quite sure where that one is at the moment, but it's a new collection, as is ours.
Yeah, and I presume some gardens will have them. Some of the open, bigger open gardens will have them.
Some of the National Trust gardens. I mean, there's quite a few, for example, in the Isabella plantation at Richmond Park, but obviously it's not a national collection. So some of the old established gardens, I believe there's quite a few at Nyman's, and probably places that specialise in rhododendrons and camellias. I would suggest would have a selection of them, but you could always phone and ask before you go.
Yeah. So you mentioned, I think that the spring flowering ones are slightly fussier when it comes to flowering, and I think you said that.
Yes.
What might stop the autumn flowering ones flowering, though?
Planting them in too deep shade, they do better if they're in sun. So as long as you've got enough moisture during the summer for them to produce their buds when they develop in July, August time, then I would say grow them in full sun or just part shade. Don't grow them in deep shade, otherwise it will make them shy to flower. If you're growing them in pots, perhaps feed them a bit. But other than that, they're really easy. Just plant them and let them go.
I guess if you're growing them in pots, then you need to be consistent with the watering through the drier spells.
Exactly. They need consistent water, and they prefer to have a moist but well-drained soil if you can give it to them. So not waterlogged in the winter, which would be hard in a pot anyway, as long as you lift it up and stand it on some feet during the winter, or just move it into a rain shadow area. But they do very well in pots, as do the spring flowering camellias. So if you haven't got the right soil, then it is an option to grow them like that.
And if you were planting the autumn flowers in a container, you'd still use ericaceous compost, would you?
Well, I haven't done, but you could do.
Okay.
Yes, I mean, they will be fine if it's in a neutral compost. The only time they wouldn't if it's really, really high pH. As I say, they are more tolerant. But probably best to give them an ericaceous compost if you've got the option, and then an ericaceous feed in the spring.
Yeah. And would you do the same? Would you feed the ones that are in the ground?
I don't. You could do. People often say pour cold tea on them, give them copper nails round the bottom of the soil if they're showing chlorosis. But in my experience, you cannot change the pH of the soil. If they don't like your soil, their roots will get beyond any soil that you've improved eventually, and they will succumb. So if the soil isn't right, you're far better to try growing them in pots.
Mm-hmm. And what colour range do those come in?
The autumn flowering ones, white, pale pinks, dark pinks, right through to really, really deep crimson pinks to bright reds. Some of the bright red ones are fantastic at Christmas time. There's one called Yuletide, and it's flowering at Christmas. It's just so appropriate to go round a corner in the woodland and see this huge shrub covered in what almost look like red roses in the middle of winter. Is just amazing.
What kind of size do they reach? Are they as big as the spring flowering ones?
No, they tend to make a much better shaped tree, a lot of them, tree or shrub. Some of them are more bushy, but some will be a sort of an open branched shrub or tree with smaller leaves, so much more elegant stature. And they will probably grow up to about, in the wild, I'm not sure, to be honest, 10 foot, 15 foot eventually. But in the garden, my biggest ones now are about 8 foot, I suppose, and they're sort of 25 years old. So not enormous, and they're not too fast growing. They'll grow at a reasonable pace. But some of them are very more tree-like, and some, such as Hugh Evans, makes a much more of a sort of dense shrub. So read on the label for what habit you want.
Yeah. And do they come from the same region originally as the Japonicas?
Most of them are from Japan, although some of the hybrids you can find now, as I mentioned briefly, have been bred for certain things. A lot of them were found not to be fully hardy in perhaps our climate. So they have bred a series in the States called the Ackermann Hybrids, and they're all labelled their winter. So in their name you will find Camellia, for example, Winter's Snowman, or Winter's Star, or Winter's Sunset, or Winter's Hope. And they're a series that have all been bred, and they've been crossed sasanquas with Camellia oleifera, which has small white flowers but is more hardy. So they've been bred specifically for that purpose. And then there's a Paradise series, which are available as well. They were bred in Australia, and they're very good flowerers, and they have very, very weather resistant flowers. So there's Paradise Vanessa, for example, Paradise Hilda, etc. So you won't get sasanqua in the name, but they have been bred from sasanquas. But the traditional, more easily available ones are just straight Camellia sasanqua, and then the name,
wow,
the cultivar name.
I would have assumed they were all really hardy.
Well, the ones that you will find now generally are, but I mean, with our collection, some of them, the original ones, are perhaps not quite so hardy. So I tend to advise people to just give them a little bit of protection. If you can grow them, if you're in a cold area, grow them against a south-facing wall or fence, or just for the first year or two, I might just put a one of those plastic rabbit protectors and just give them a little bit of fleece just for the first winter, because what you might find is they've been grown in nursery conditions, maybe in polytunnels, and they're not hardened off enough. If we suddenly had an early cold snap when you put the plant out, you don't know its history. Once it's established, it will be more hardy. But I would say just give it a little bit of protection to bring it through the first winter if it's not very big and you're in a cold area.
Yeah. And thinking about wall training or pruning of any sort, you spoke about them as hedges. Should you prune them? Do you need to?
You don't need to prune them at all. I mean, if you can give them space to grow to their full extent, then that's perfect. But if you've got a smaller garden and you want to grow it, then by all means prune it to keep it to the size that you want and the shape. And they respond very well to pruning, as long as you prune them after they've flowered. So I would prune it early in the spring, sort of March, April time, and then you don't lose any of the flowers for the following season, because the buds will form in the summer. So yeah, prune them then. So if you're growing them as a hedge, I would say it would be a slightly informal hedge. Otherwise, if you keep it neatly clipped, you might risk losing your flowers. But as an informal hedge, they make a beautiful choice.
Yeah, and could you potentially limb them up? So remove the lower branches and have them as...
You could, and grow them as sort of standards.
Yeah.
They're very amenable to any sort of pruning that you want to do. But I don't see the beauty in them. A lot of things I like the beauty of the natural growth, the natural shape of the plant, so I don't like to do it too artificially, but it's everybody's choice.
You mentioned some of the hybrid varieties. If you had to choose maybe, I don't know, 2 or 3 really good varieties that you would recommend to people, what would you say?
Hugh Evans. I think if I could only have one, I would have that one, purely because it's such a good flowerer. It goes on from October and it can still be going in February, and it's not a shy flowerer. It's covered in blooms for much of that time. They're single flowers with lovely prominent yellow stamens, beautifully scented, and it's a really, really reliable one, and it's fairly widely available. It's a really good variety. I like some of the darker pink coloured ones, so Lavender Queen would be a good one. And then there's 2 good red ones. Crimson King is excellent, flowers autumn right over Christmas, and then Yuletide comes slightly later. And then if I was to choose a white one, my favourite would probably be Gay Sue, which has sort of double flowers and beautifully scented. I would say the paler the flower colour, the better the scent. So although the red flowers are scented, they're not quite as strong as the pale pink and the whites. So for the scent, I would go for that one, although it is very difficult to get hold of, particularly at the moment. I'm not sure why. There are other white ones that you can choose, but I would hold out for that one. So those would be my favourite ones.
Thinking about the scent, obviously it's quite common to get things that are camellia scented. I say this as an M&S shopper. I'm sure there's a range in there. But can you cut the branches and take them indoors as cut flowers?
You can do, but I wouldn't say it's ideal. They don't last a particularly long time. I mean, I do bring big branches of the spring flowering ones and the autumn flowering ones indoors, but they don't really. I mean, the autumn flowers will release the scent, but I would say it would be only for a day, really, once you bring them inside. There are other things I would bring inside for scent, but they will look good for a couple of days.
Fair enough.
But they're not the most successful things. But if I was pruning it, for example, and I had branches to spare, then yes, I would bring them inside.
I think probably a lot of us are used to seeing them in sort of shrub plantings. Do they play nicely in a border, for example?
Yes, I mean, a lot of my borders are what I would call mixed borders. So I'll have some evergreen structure running through the spine of it, or at the back, as it were. And they're really, really good specimens for that. You can clip them to the size you want to keep them, and they'll give you interest, extending the interest, obviously, into the autumn and through the winter. So they make a good choice in mixed borders. But I like them in a woodland setting where they're more, where they would be more naturally found in the wild. So sort of on the edge of the woodland, the sunny edge, if you like. They look really at home there. That would be my favoured planting spot.
Well, I have to say, I am sold on them. I have got some at home, but I need more. Finally, do they have any pests and diseases that people need to worry about?
If they're grown in pots, and for nursery growers, the greatest problem would be vine weevil, and they particularly go for them when they're young plants, and there's a lot of soft compost that they can bury in and lay their eggs. But once they're out in the ground, I haven't found any problems with them at all. Really, no pests that bother them or diseases. So no, very easily grown.
And if people want to see the ones that you've got available, how do they find them?
What, by coming to visit, do you mean?
Yes, or do you sell them online?
Yes, we do. Although we've had an article in the English Garden magazine this year, and since that we've had so many phone calls, and they've all been going out mail order, so that the stocks are diminishing. There are still some left. But they're welcome to come and see them. The gardens are open here every day except for Mondays, 10 till 5. So you can see them growing in the garden and then purchase from the nursery as well.
A very big thank you to Fiona, who actually did that interview twice, as due to a massive IT failure, I lost the original recording, so I'm doubly grateful for her time. Thank you to you for listening. I hope you'll go check out Green Island Gardens and follow Fiona's work on social media. Dr. Ian Bedford is up next, talking about what can happen when an ecosystem becomes out of whack.
One August morning, back in 2012, I looked out of my window and I saw something very strange. My dew-laden lawn appeared to be covered in hundreds of small sticks. So I went outside to investigate, and to my surprise realised that they weren't sticks, but they were huge brown slugs, some up to 6 inches long. I then discovered that they weren't just on my lawn, but they were also all over the vegetable plot and in the greenhouse, devouring everything, including native snails and even a dead mouse. So where had they come from? And what was going on? Grabbing a large bucket and a trowel, I started to scoop them up, and within 30 minutes, I'd collected over 350. There was clearly something very odd about these slugs, and their infestation was something that I'd never experienced before. So with the help of colleagues in my lab, we decided to investigate them in more detail, and we soon identified them as the Spanish slug, an invasive species that over recent years had been steadily moving northwards from the Mediterranean basin. And here it was, now in the UK, and in my garden. So as word spread through the media, many people got in contact to report Spanish slug infestations that they'd also found within their own gardens, all across East Anglia and heading south and west, providing us with evidence that the invader was spreading across Britain. But why was this slug such a concern to us? Well, unlike our large native slugs that eat decaying vegetation, the Spanish slug was a serious plant pest across mainland Europe, and controlling it had proved very difficult. Having evolved within a hot, arid environment, the Spanish slug had survival traits that actually gave it a huge advantage over the native slugs that existed within cooler and wetter environments. It laid twice as many eggs, matured quicker, and produced vast quantities of thick, sticky slime that not only protected it from sunlight and being eaten by predators, but also allowed it to move over dry, rough surfaces with ease. This meant that all of the commonly used slug barriers we tested, such as grit, eggshells, and even copper tape, failed to deter Spanish slugs. And nematodes too showed no effect in controlling this slimy surface-dwelling mollusk. The only non-chemical option left for home gardeners to use appeared to be hand collection, or rather large beer traps. But extremely worrying for the many commercial growers who relied on slug pellets to protect their crops, we also found that a single mature Spanish slug would eat up to 20 pellets before it was affected. So with their potential to wreak havoc across Britain, and no effective control measures, we could only watch and continue to monitor their appearance and spread over the following years. 4 years then passed before it became clear that the expected decimation of our gardens and crops was not actually happening, and that new reports of Spanish slug infestations were becoming far less frequent. And this trend has continued through to the present day, with no apparent explanation other than perhaps it being the effect of our inconsistent weather conditions. However, I think the reason is a lot more simple, in that it's a completely natural process that has occurred time after time when an invasive species spreads to a new location. For a short while, just like a new disease, the invader runs riot within its new home, where it is alien to the local ecology. But then, over time, the resident native species, the predators and the parasites, begin finding ways to deal with the invader, using it as a new food source, and eventually suppressing its rampant behaviour. And with the Spanish slugs, I've been able to see this in action within my own garden, where they're still present, but no longer a problem, thanks in part to the blackbirds that previously avoided these slimy creatures, but have now learnt to wipe them on the grass to remove the slime before eating them.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.